At the forefront of. In the leading or most advanced position. To put it another way. To express the same idea in a different way. There is no denying that. It is impossible to dispute this particular fact. Analyzing the pros and cons. Examining the advantages and disadvantages. It becomes apparent. It becomes clearly seen, known, understood over time. Ongoing debate continues. A continuous discussion regarding a particular matter. That being said, despite that, another point should be considered. In the long run. Over a long period of time in the future. In many respects. In many different ways or particular aspects. From a broader perspective. Considering the situation from a wider viewpoint. A common misconception. A widely held but incorrect belief about something. It is generally accepted. Most people commonly consider this to be from a long-term perspective. Considering effects over an extended period of time. A significant amount of. A large or important quantity of something. To put this into perspective. To explain something by showing its wider context. From a broader standpoint. Considering matters from a wider point of view. In the current circumstances. Under the conditions existing at present. A major challenge remains. An important difficulty still needs to be addressed. A matter of concern. An issue that causes considerable worry. From my standpoint. According to my particular viewpoint or position. By and large. Considering most circumstances and situations. In practical terms. When considered according to real circumstances. A growing body of evidence. Increasing evidence supporting a particular conclusion. It goes without saying. Something obvious that requires no further explanation. On closer inspection. After examining something more carefully and thoroughly. In light of this. Considering this particular fact or situation. More often than not. Usually happening or being true generally. This raises the question. This situation creates an important consideration. Beyond any doubt. Completely certain, without possibility of disagreement. In the broader context. When considered within a wider situation. At first sight. When something is initially seen or considered. The evidence suggests. Available information indicates that something is likely. Against this backdrop. Considering the surrounding circumstances or conditions. It is widely believed. Many people commonly accept this particular view. On the whole. Considering everything or generally speaking overall. A key consideration. An important factor requiring careful thought. In contrast to. When compared with something noticeably different. It is increasingly evident. It is becoming progressively clearer or more obvious. In the absence of. When something is unavailable or missing entirely. A fundamental issue. A basic and extremely important problem. To put it simply. To explain something in simpler language. A plausible explanation. A believable reason that could explain something. A substantial amount. A large or considerable quantity of something. This is particularly relevant. This is especially connected to current circumstances. In the foreseeable future. During the reasonably predictable future period. A compelling argument. A very convincing reason supporting something. In comparison with. When compared against another thing or situation. A widespread phenomenon. Something occurring commonly across many places. For the most part. Generally, but not completely in every case. There is little doubt. There is very little uncertainty about something. A highly contentious issue. A strongly disputed and controversial subject. It is crucial to recognize. It is extremely important to understand something. On balance. Considering advantages and disadvantages together. This is largely due to. This mainly happens because of something. A growing concern. An increasingly worrying issue or situation. In my considered opinion. According to my carefully formed personal judgment. In the face of. Despite encountering something challenging. A worthwhile investment. Something valuable enough to justify spending resources. In turn. As a consequence of something else. By comparison. When considered alongside another situation or thing. It is important to acknowledge. It is necessary to recognize something openly. A potential drawback. A possible disadvantage or negative consequence. With regard to. Concerning or relating to something specific. A profound effect. An extremely deep or significant impact. It could be argued that someone could reasonably present an argument In accordance with. Following or complying with something established. The underlying cause. The basic reason behind something occurring. A pressing need. A requirement demanding immediate attention. In particular. Especially among several possible examples. A practical approach. A realistic method for solving something. In the wake of. Following something, especially an important event. This highlights the fact. This emphasizes an important existing fact. From an ethical perspective. When considered according to moral principles. A notable difference. A clearly noticeable distinction between things. It is highly likely. Something has a very strong probability. In the meantime. During the period before something happens. A serious consequence. A significant and potentially harmful result. Contrary to popular belief. Opposite to what most people commonly believe. A valuable insight. An important and useful understanding gained. This demonstrates that. This clearly shows that something is true. A major contributing factor. An important element helping cause something. In other words, expressing the same meaning differently and clearly. A growing trend. A pattern that is increasingly becoming common. In the absence of evidence. When supporting information or proof is unavailable. This is particularly significant. This is especially important or meaningful here. From an economic perspective. When considered according to economic factors. In retrospect. When considering something after it happened. A considerable challenge. A fairly difficult problem requiring serious effort. On the contrary. Completely opposite to the previous statement. A striking example. An especially noticeable and impressive example. In accordance with this. Consistently with this particular fact or principle. A relatively small proportion. A comparatively limited part of something. It is worth considering. This deserves careful thought before deciding. In recent years. During the comparatively recent period of time. The underlying issue. The fundamental problem beneath the surface. In the context of. When considered within a particular situation. This inevitably leads to. This unavoidably produces a particular result. It is important to bear in mind. It is necessary to remember this important point. A highly effective measure. An extremely successful action for achieving something. A growing body of research. Increasing research supporting knowledge about something. A significant factor behind. An important reason causing something to happen. In the current climate. Under present social or political conditions. A substantial body of evidence. A large amount of supporting information or proof. At the expense of quality. By sacrificing quality to achieve something else. It is increasingly difficult to. It is becoming progressively harder to accomplish. A highly persuasive argument. An extremely convincing reason supporting a position. In relation to this. Concerning or connected with this matter. A fundamental distinction. An essential difference between two things. In many cases. In numerous situations or particular instances. A noticeable improvement. A clearly observable positive change. This tends to suggest. This generally indicates something is probably true. In direct response to. As an immediate reaction to something. It is widely acknowledged. Many people openly recognize this fact. A potentially viable solution. A possible solution that could realistically work. It is conceivable that. It is possible to imagine something happening. A major obstacle. A significant barrier preventing progress or success. This gives rise to. This causes something to emerge or develop. A well-established principle. A principle accepted through established practice. At the very least. At the minimum possible level or amount. It is increasingly recognized. More people are progressively accepting this truth. A serious threat. A significant danger capable of causing harm. A clear indication of. Strong evidence showing something clearly. On the one hand. Introducing one side of an argument. In the long term. Over a considerably extended period of time. A significant shift. A substantial change in direction or position. In relation to. Concerning or connected with something specific. A potentially damaging effect. A possible harmful consequence or impact. In this particular context. Within this specific situation or circumstance. A more balanced approach. A method considering different sides fairly. It is difficult to determine. It is hard to establish something precisely. It would be reasonable to argue. It would be sensible to present this argument. A relatively minor issue. A comparatively small or unimportant problem. In the absence of regulation. When official rules or controls are lacking. A major advantage. A particularly important benefit or strength. A key determinant. A factor determining a particular outcome. In view of this, considering this particular fact or situation, in contrast with, when compared with something noticeably different. This serves to illustrate. This helps clearly demonstrate a particular point. A growing sense of. An increasingly strong feeling or awareness. In the wider community. Throughout the larger surrounding social group. A potentially serious problem. A possible issue with significant harmful effects. It is tempting to assume. It is easy but potentially unwise to believe. It is essential that. It is absolutely necessary that something happens. In the wake of recent changes. Following changes that have happened recently. This raises serious concerns. This creates worries requiring careful attention. At this stage. At this particular point in development. In terms of quality. When considering the standard of something. It is generally assumed. People commonly believe something without proof. On closer examination. After something is studied more carefully. It is worth emphasizing. This point deserves particular attention and emphasis. A long-term consequence. A result continuing over an extended period. From a practical standpoint. When considered according to real circumstances. A noticeable trend. A clearly observable developing pattern. A highly complex issue. A complicated problem involving many factors. In the absence of effective measures. When useful actions or solutions are unavailable. A considerable burden. A substantial responsibility, difficulty, or pressure. A positive development. A change producing beneficial results or progress. This can be explained by. This can be understood through this reason. A major implication. An important possible consequence or meaning. In light of recent developments. Considering changes that have happened recently. A significant improvement in. A substantial positive change in something. It is difficult to overlook. It is hard to ignore something important. A compelling reason to. A highly convincing reason for doing something. This has far-reaching implications. This produces consequences affecting many areas. From an educational perspective. When considered according to educational factors. It is not uncommon for. It happens fairly frequently that something occurs. In the foreseeable future. During the reasonably predictable future period. It would be misleading to suggest. It would wrongly create a particular impression. A potentially effective strategy. A possible plan capable of producing results. In the context of globalization. When considered within worldwide integration. It is crucial to consider. It is extremely important to think about. A significant departure from. A substantial change away from something. This is largely attributable to. This mainly results from a particular cause. From a historical perspective. When considered according to historical circumstances. A pressing social issue. An urgent problem affecting society significantly. A well-informed decision. A decision based on sufficient reliable information. In response to growing demand. As demand progressively increases for something. A potentially positive outcome. A possible result producing beneficial effects. A substantial financial burden. A large and difficult monetary responsibility. In the absence of sufficient resources. When adequate materials or funds are unavailable. This appears to indicate. This seems to show something particular clearly. From an individual perspective. When considered according to personal circumstances. It is worth pointing out. This particular fact deserves specific attention. In stark contrast to. In an extremely obvious and striking difference. A more comprehensive approach. A method considering all important aspects together. It is increasingly common for. Something is happening more frequently nowadays. In practical terms, therefore. Consequently, when considered according to reality. This is largely because. This mainly happens for this reason. From a global perspective. When considered across the entire world. It is essential to recognize. It is absolutely necessary to understand something. A significant shift toward. A substantial movement in a particular direction. In line with. Consistent with a particular idea or standard. This can be seen in. This is clearly observable within something. It is widely recognized that. People commonly acknowledge that something is true. A major limitation of. An important weakness restricting something significantly. This may ultimately result in. This might eventually produce a particular outcome. A carefully considered approach. A method developed through thoughtful examination. It is difficult to ignore. It is hard to disregard something important. In the absence of clear guidelines. When specific instructions or rules are unavailable. This is directly linked to. This has an immediate connection with something. From time to time. Occasionally at irregular intervals, but not frequently. The problem is threefold. The issue consists of three separate significant parts. In the same fashion. In a similar way, using the same method or approach. Up to the present time. Until the current moment or point in time. Contrary to expectations. Opposite to what people reasonably anticipated or expected. It is generally agreed that. Most people widely accept this idea as true or valid. On a regular basis. Happening consistently at fixed or frequent intervals. A progressive trend toward. A gradual movement or development in a direction. Conceptually similar models. Models sharing closely related underlying ideas or concepts. There is no denying that. It cannot reasonably be argued against or disputed. It is worth emphasizing that this point deserves special attention and importance. In light of recent developments, Considering the latest events or important changes. Taking everything into account. Considering all relevant facts and circumstances together. In conclusion, it is evident that. Finally, the evidence clearly supports this conclusion. On closer examination. After examining more carefully and in greater detail. Under these circumstances. Given the current situation or existing conditions. To a considerable degree. To a large and noticeable extent or significant level. In response to this challenge. As a reaction to this particular difficult situation or problem. In comparison, however. However, when considered alongside another situation. This has the potential to. This could possibly achieve a particular outcome. A growing awareness of. An increasingly strong understanding or recognition of. A substantial difference between. A large and important distinction separating things. From a social perspective. When considered according to social factors. In the long run, this could. Over time, this might eventually produce something. A highly effective way of. An extremely successful method for achieving something. At the individual level. When considered for each person separately. It is often argued that people frequently claim or maintain that a considerable number of factors, many significant elements affecting a particular situation, in contrast, it appears that available evidence seems to indicate something. This should be viewed as. This should be understood or considered as. A significant obstacle to. A barrier preventing something from happening. A potentially damaging trend. A possible pattern causing significant future harm. A more sustainable alternative. A longer-lasting option causing fewer problems. It is difficult to establish. It is hard to determine something conclusively. In the wider context. When considered within a larger situation. From a financial perspective. When considered according to monetary factors. It is increasingly apparent that it is becoming progressively clearer that something in the face of adversity, despite experiencing serious difficulties or hardship, this could potentially lead to. This might possibly cause a particular outcome. In terms of effectiveness. When considering how successfully something works. From a societal perspective. When considered according to society-wide factors. It would be fair to say. It would be reasonable and accurate to state. A major area of concern. An important subject causing considerable worry. This is likely to continue. This will probably keep happening in future. A potentially valuable opportunity. A possible chance offering considerable benefits. At the same time, it remains. Nevertheless, during that period something continues. It is crucial to bear in mind. It is extremely important to remember this. A substantial impact on. A large and significant effect upon something. This reflects a wider trend. This represents a broader developing pattern. A significant barrier to. An obstacle preventing progress or achievement. From a policy perspective. When considered according to policy-related factors. A carefully balanced approach. A method fairly considering different competing factors. This could have serious implications. This might produce significant consequences or effects. At the societal level, when considered across society as a whole, it is difficult to assess. It is hard to evaluate something accurately. This remains a contentious issue. This continues to cause disagreement and debate. It is worth questioning whether it deserves consideration whether something is true. A potentially serious drawback. A possible disadvantage with significant negative effects. A significant contribution toward. An important addition helping achieve something. From an ethical standpoint, when judged according to moral principles, a more targeted approach, a method specifically designed for particular needs. It is essential to acknowledge. It is absolutely necessary to recognize something. A major factor contributing to. An important element helping cause something. In comparison with the past. When compared against earlier circumstances. In the face of growing demand. Despite increasingly high requirements for something. This raises an important issue. This creates an important matter requiring attention. In the wider social context. When considered within broader social circumstances. In the absence of meaningful reform. When substantial improvements or changes are lacking. This has had a profound effect. This has produced an extremely deep impact. It is worth considering whether it deserves careful thought whether something holds a major step forward, an advance toward improvement or progress. This could serve as. This might function effectively as something. From a legal perspective. When considered according to legal factors. A more effective means of. A more successful method for achieving something. In the absence of adequate funding. When sufficient financial support is unavailable. This is not without risks. This involves certain dangers or possible problems. At a broader level. When considered from a wider perspective. A potentially useful framework. A possible structure that could prove helpful. In the context of modern society. When considered within today's social conditions. This is increasingly becoming. This is progressively developing into something. From a cultural perspective. When considered according to cultural factors. It is important to bear in mind that it is necessary to remember this particular fact. It is worth noting that this particular point deserves attention and recognition. A potentially effective measure. A possible action capable of producing results. In the absence of public awareness. When people lack sufficient understanding. This has become increasingly apparent. This has become progressively clearer over time. A considerable challenge for. A significant difficulty facing someone or something. From a personal perspective. When considered according to individual experience. A significant impact upon. A substantial effect on something or someone. At a global level. When considered across the entire world. It is essential to take into account. It is necessary to consider something carefully. A more realistic assessment. A more accurate evaluation based on reality. In the absence of long-term planning. When extended future preparation is unavailable. This could ultimately result in. This might eventually cause a particular outcome. It is increasingly difficult to ignore. It is becoming progressively harder to disregard. A major area for improvement. An important field requiring positive development. This is closely connected with. This has a strong relationship with something. At the community level. When considered across a local community. It is fair to suggest that it is reasonable to propose that something a potentially sustainable solution, a possible answer capable of lasting long term, in the face of uncertainty. Despite lacking certainty about future outcomes. For the time being. Temporarily until circumstances change or improve later. On rare occasions. Only happening very infrequently or exceptionally. In my honest opinion. According to my sincere and truthful personal viewpoint. To a remarkable extent. Significantly beyond what is normally expected or usual. As a point of reference. Used as a basis for standard comparison or guidance. In all likelihood. Most probably based on available circumstances. Under the right conditions. When suitable requirements are properly met. To put it into perspective. To understand something in its proper context clearly. In line with expectations. Consistent with what was reasonably anticipated. At the same time. Simultaneously while another event or action also occurs. To the best possible outcome. Resulting in the most favorable achievable final result. Without further hesitation. Immediately without any additional delay or uncertainty. At any given moment. During any specific time without considering past or future. In the best possible way. using the most effective and suitable approach available. At any rate. In any case, regardless of previous circumstances. To be perfectly fair. Speaking with honesty and impartial judgment always. As a rule of thumb. A practical guideline based on general experience. It comes as no surprise. It is expected because the outcome was already anticipated. This has raised concerns about. This has created worries regarding something. This is a clear indication that. This strongly demonstrates that something is true. A significant factor behind this. An important reason causing this particular situation. In the absence of cooperation. When people or groups fail working together. This could potentially undermine. This might possibly weaken or damage something. A more balanced perspective. A viewpoint fairly considering different sides. From an environmental standpoint. When judged according to environmental considerations. It is worth emphasizing that this particular fact deserves strong emphasis. In the current economic climate, under present economic conditions and circumstances, a substantial contribution to society. A large beneficial addition to social well-being. It is crucial to understand that it is extremely important to realize this fact. This has become a major issue. This has developed into an important problem. A significant degree of progress. A notably substantial amount of advancement. From a practical perspective, when considered according to realistic circumstances, it is increasingly clear that it is becoming progressively obvious that something a substantial body of research, a large amount of systematic academic investigation, A major implication of this. An important consequence resulting from this. In the broader perspective. When viewed within a wider context. This deserves serious consideration. This requires careful and thoughtful attention. A potentially significant advantage. A possible benefit of considerable importance. A more nuanced perspective. A viewpoint recognizing subtle differences and complexities. In the face of these challenges. Despite experiencing these particular difficulties. From a social standpoint. When considered according to social circumstances. It would be misleading to claim. It would wrongly suggest something is true. A major factor in shaping. An element influencing how something develops. A potentially effective response. A possible reaction capable of producing results. In the context of education. When considered within educational circumstances. This is fundamentally linked to. This is essentially connected with something. A significant barrier to progress. An obstacle preventing advancement or development. From a historical standpoint. When considered according to historical circumstances. It is worth asking whether it deserves consideration whether something is true. In the absence of reliable data. When trustworthy information or statistics are unavailable. This can be regarded as. This can reasonably be considered something. A major consequence for. An important result affecting someone or something. In contrast, there is. Conversely, another different situation or fact exists. This has profound implications for. This creates important consequences for something. A potentially valuable contribution. A possible addition providing considerable benefit. From a broader social perspective. When considered within wider social circumstances. It is essential to bear in mind that it is absolutely necessary to remember this fact. In the face of rapid change. Despite experiencing fast and significant transformation. A major source of uncertainty. An important cause of doubt or unpredictability. This raises broader questions about. This creates wider questions concerning something. From a scientific perspective. When considered according to scientific principles. It is crucial to acknowledge that it is extremely important to recognize this fact. A significant departure from tradition. A substantial change away from traditional practices. This could potentially exacerbate. This might possibly make something significantly worse. A major obstacle to development. An important barrier preventing growth or progress. From an individual standpoint. When considered from one person's viewpoint. It would be fair to argue. It would be reasonable to make this argument. A potentially damaging impact. A possible effect causing considerable harm. A more practical alternative. A more realistic option for solving something. It is worth bearing in mind that it is significant to remember this particular fact. A significant contribution toward. An important addition helping achieve something. A substantial effect on. A large and significant influence upon something. A major issue facing society. An important problem currently affecting society. This could ultimately undermine. This might eventually weaken or damage something. A potentially transformative solution. A possible answer capable of major change. At the broader societal level. When considered across society more generally. In response to emerging challenges. As a reaction to newly developing difficulties. This represents a major shift. This constitutes a significant change in direction. From an analytical perspective. When examined through systematic reasoning. A more balanced assessment. A fairer evaluation considering different relevant factors. In the absence of sufficient evidence. When enough supporting proof is unavailable. This may ultimately contribute to. This might eventually help cause something. At the end of the day. Ultimately, after considering everything involved carefully. A significant factor to consider. An important element requiring careful consideration. In the final analysis. After considering everything carefully and thoroughly. This ultimately comes down to. Ultimately, this depends upon one essential factor. The broader picture is clear. The overall situation is now clearly understandable. It is worth noting. It deserves attention because it is significant. A viable alternative. A practical option that can successfully work. To a considerable extent. To a fairly large or significant degree. In essence. In the most basic or fundamental sense. A significant proportion. A large and important part of something. At the expense of. Causing harm or loss to something else. It remains unclear. It is still uncertain or not understood. In conjunction with. Together with something else for a purpose. It is reasonable to assume. It is sensible to believe something likely. This can be attributed to this happened because of a particular factor. In terms of regarding a particular aspect or specific area. A considerable number. A fairly large quantity of people or things. A long-standing problem. An issue existing for a very long. To cut a long story short. Skip unnecessary details and explain briefly instead. That's easier said than done. Appears simple but is actually difficult to accomplish. For the sake of argument. Assume something temporarily to discuss a point. More often than not. Happens usually rather than only occasionally or rarely. One way or another. Somehow, by some method, or eventually anyway. That's not necessarily true. That statement may not be fully accurate or correct. Let's not jump to conclusions. Avoid forming opinions before knowing all facts. That makes perfect sense. It is completely logical and easy to understand. I have every reason to believe. I strongly believe based on convincing evidence. It's all part of the process. Contributes naturally toward achieving the final outcome. I have mixed feelings about it. I feel both positive and negative emotions about it. To make matters worse. Introducing something that an already bad situation. Let's focus on the main issue. Concentrate only on the most important problem first. Let me explain what I mean. Allow me to clarify my intended meaning clearly. It's a common misconception. Many people wrongly believe something that is false. Let's keep an open mind. Remain willing to consider different ideas fairly. It's difficult to put into words. Hard to express clearly using spoken language. It makes a huge difference. It creates a significant change or improvement overall. A substantial impact. A large and significant effect on something. In the short term. During a relatively brief period of time. To a certain degree. Partly or within some limited measure. It is often overlooked. People frequently fail to notice or consider. In spite of this. Despite this particular fact or situation occurring. A substantial decline. A large and noticeable decrease in something. A lasting impression. A strong effect that remains for long. A substantial increase. A large and noticeable rise in something. In sharp contrast. Completely different when compared with something else. In response to this. As a reaction to this particular situation. This is not necessarily the case. This statement may not always be true. This can lead to. This can cause something to happen subsequently. A considerable degree of. A fairly large amount or level of. From my perspective. According to my viewpoint or understanding. At the central point of the issue. At the most important part of problem. A fundamental principle. A basic rule underlying a system or belief. A significant proportion of. A large and important part of something. This is closely associated with. This is strongly connected or related to something. At the same time. During the same period or moment simultaneously. In comparison to. When compared with another person or thing. A far-reaching consequence. An effect extending widely across situations or areas. To put the matter plainly. To explain something clearly and directly. A considerable proportion of. A fairly large part or percentage of something. This is partly because. This happens partly due to a reason. It is reasonable to suggest. It is sensible to propose or state. A substantial reduction. A large and noticeable decrease in something. A considerable amount of attention. A large degree of focus given toward something. In comparison with previous years. Compared with earlier years or periods of time. A major source of concern. An important cause of worry or anxiety. This is particularly evident in. This is especially clear or noticeable within something. It is difficult to predict. It is hard to know future developments accurately. A significant reduction in. A large and important decrease in something. At the core of this issue. At the most important part of this problem. A significant degree of. A considerable amount or level of something. At the outset of. At the beginning of a particular process. A substantial improvement in. A large positive change within a particular area. At a fundamental level. At the most basic underlying level possible. It is reasonable to conclude. It is sensible to reach a particular conclusion. A potential solution lies in. A possible answer can be found through. It is essential to address. It is necessary to deal with something. It is worth bearing in mind. It deserves consideration when making decisions. In the absence of political will. When leaders lack determination to make changes. This can have serious consequences. This can produce severe or harmful results. A considerable amount of research. A large quantity of systematic study or investigation. It is important to note. It is necessary to mention or recognize. A serious cause for concern. A major reason for worry or anxiety. This is partly attributable to. This is partly caused by a particular factor. A considerable amount of evidence. A large quantity of supporting facts or information. A substantial increase in demand. A large rise in people's desire for something. This can be attributed largely to. This is mainly caused by a particular factor. In the absence of accountability. When nobody is held responsible for actions. This has resulted in. This has caused an outcome or consequence. A considerable degree of uncertainty. A fairly high level of doubt or unpredictability. It is important to emphasize. It is necessary to give special importance. A more flexible approach. A method allowing greater adaptation to circumstances. At this juncture. At this particular stage or point. It is difficult to argue against. It is hard to disagree with something convincingly. An extremely useful and workable answer to something. In response to this trend. As a reaction to this developing pattern. A considerable amount of time. A fairly long period spent doing something. It is difficult to determine whether. It is hard to establish if something happened. This is particularly relevant to. This is especially applicable to a particular situation. A substantial amount of effort. A large quantity of energy devoted towards something. It would be reasonable to suggest. It would be sensible to propose or state. From a long-term perspective. Considering effects over an extended period of time. It is important to recognize that it is necessary to understand or acknowledge something. This is primarily driven by. This is mainly caused or influenced by something. A potentially beneficial consequence. A possible result that could produce significant benefits. At the heart of the debate. At the central point of the argument. It is reasonable to maintain that. It is sensible to argue or believe that. It is difficult to overlook the fact. It is hard to ignore an important reality. In response to public concern. As a reaction to worries expressed by people. A more appropriate approach. A more suitable method for handling something. At a deeper level. At a more profound or underlying level. A significant increase in awareness. A large rise in people's understanding or knowledge. In the absence of clear evidence. When sufficient convincing proof is unavailable. From a global standpoint. Considering matters from an international perspective. A more effective long-term strategy. A better plan for achieving lasting results. It is increasingly difficult to predict. Forecasting future developments is becoming harder. In the broader interests of society. For society's wider benefit and collective well-being. A considerable number of people. A fairly large quantity of individuals or persons. This is particularly concerning because. This is especially worrying for a specific reason.